r/NoSleep. Posted by you/Carbodex. 3 p.m. Have you ever noticed how quiet the world gets at 3 p.m.? It's like everyone holds their breath for a moment, the day on the brink of spiraling towards evening. The sun is still high, burning away, but the heat of the day starts to wane, making way for the cool shadows that reach out like elongated fingers from the buildings. At least, that's how I've always seen it. My name is Jack, and I live in a small town called Harper's Glen, population 1,457. Now, I'm not someone who courts danger. I'm just an average Joe, maybe a little shy, but content in my world of regularity and routine. But the most terrifying things have a way of finding you even when you aren't looking for them, and that's what happened one fateful day. I was driving home from work on the old familiar road, flanked by tall pines standing like silent sentinels on both sides. The day was like any other, mundane as watching paint dry. But then, it was 3 p.m. Something made me stop my truck right on the narrow asphalt strip. An oddly dressed figure of a man was walking down the center of the road towards me. He was old, too old to be out on such a scorcher of a day. His clothes were weirdly formal for our laid-back town, a charcoal suit and a battered fedora. He held a weathered briefcase that seemed heavy, as if it held more than just papers. The strange sight sent an involuntary shudder down my spine. But being a good Samaritan, I couldn't leave an old man in distress under the sweltering sun. I pulled over, rolled down the window and offered him a lift. The old man paused, a knowing smile creeping onto his craggy face. He seemed to inspect me, sizing me up like one would a juicy steak. An uncomfortable silence hung between us, prickling the back of my neck, before he finally nodded and opened the passenger door. "Thank you, young man," he rasped, his voice grating like sandpaper. "I could use a ride." As he settled in beside me, the truck dipped slightly under his weight. His presence filled the small space, the air growing denser. The earlier quiet of the afternoon was now pierced by an eerie dread. A storm was coming, I thought, not in the sky but in my world. As I shifted the truck back into gear and the road unfolded before us, I couldn't shake off the feeling that my life was about to take a terrifying detour. Little did I know, it was not just my life, but the piece of the entire Harper's Glen that hung in balance. As we moved along the deserted road, the old man stayed silent, fixated on the briefcase that now sat on his lap. Every so often, he would run his bony fingers over it, almost as if it were something precious. I tried to make small talk, to break the tension that had filled the cab, but he responded with only grunts and nods. The minutes dragged on, each one filled with more dread than the last. "Do you live around here?" I finally asked. The man turned his head to look at me, his sharp gaze piercing through my pretense of normalcy. "I once did," he replied, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "I'm here to finish some unfinished business." Something in the way he said it made my heart drop, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The day had turned eerie, the heat of the afternoon somehow replaced with a chilling sense of fear. I decided to drop him off at the town center and be done with it. As we approached Harper's Glen, the quaint buildings started to appear. The town was unusually quiet. Kids, who usually played on the streets around this time, were absent. Mrs. Henderson, the town's bustling baker, was nowhere in sight at her usually open bakery. It was as if the whole town held its breath, aware of the strange passenger in my truck. A shiver traced my spine, a warning, but I shoved it aside. When we arrived at the center, the old man didn't get out. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes twinkling with a terrifying gleam. "Thank you, Jack. But I'm afraid my destination lies a bit further," he said. The sudden use of my name by this stranger rattled me. I hadn't introduced myself, had I? A cold wave of realization washed over me. This wasn't just about giving a lift to an old man. There was something far more sinister at play. The quaint familiarity of Harper's Glen felt foreign, like a stage set for a horrifying play, and I was unwittingly cast as the lead. Swallowing my rising panic, I turned to the old man. "Where do you need to go?" He smiled, a strange sort of satisfaction seeping into his aged features. He pointed to the road leading out of the town, the one that went up to the old abandoned sawmill. A place that had been deserted for decades, a place filled with its own local horror stories of accidents and strange occurrences. My heart pounded in my chest, an alarm bell ringing incessantly. This wasn't right. But what could I do? I was a man of my word, and despite the fear creeping up my spine, I drove him to the sawmill, the rusted machinery and rotting wood looming ominously under the fading afternoon sun. We got out of the truck, the gravel crunching under our shoes. The silence here was different, the stillness not of peace but of a place forgotten by time. The old man finally opened his briefcase, and my heart pounded harder in my chest. I half expected a weapon or some supernatural relic. But all he pulled out was an old photograph. He handed it to me, his gaze intense. It was a picture of 3 young men, barely more than boys, their smiles wide and carefree. They stood in front of this very sawmill, it in its heyday, thriving and bustling. My breath hitched as I realized that one of them was him, his features recognizable despite the weight of years between then and now. And the other? I blinked in disbelief. It was my grandfather. I came to keep a promise we made, he said, his voice suddenly choked with emotion. We swore that if any of us survived the horrors of this place, we'd come back. We'd face it, not run from it. My world spun. What was he talking about? Grandpa never mentioned any horrors, let alone a pact. Suddenly, the old man wasn't just a stranger, he was a harbinger of a dreadful past. A past my grandfather never shared, a past that now threatened to shatter my peaceful existence. The hushed whispers and scary tales about the sawmill were no longer just stories. They were real, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The old man, my grandfather's friend, led me into the abandoned sawmill. My heart was pounding like a drum against my ribs, each beat echoing the fear that had crawled its way into my veins. As we moved deeper into the shadows, a sense of dread filled the air, painting the decrepit walls and ancient machinery with a fresh coat of terror. The man, Frank, started to recount a tale from their youth. The sawmill, he said, wasn't just a place of work. It was a house of horrors, hiding a sadistic overseer who relished the pain of others. Accidents weren't accidents at all, but the result of twisted games of life and death. My grandfather, Frank, and their friend Peter, decided to fight back. But only 2 of them made it out alive. The story sent chills down my spine, the familiar walls of the mill seeming to close in on me. The old rusty saws, the forgotten tools, they all bore silent witness to the atrocities once committed here. The horror wasn't in some ghoul or ghost, but in the very human capacity for evil. We swore we'd return, put an end to the fear that still hovers here, Frank's voice echoed through the mill. But your grandfather passed away before we could, and Peter? Well, he didn't make it out that fateful night. Frank's gaze fell onto an old hatch, one that led to the overseer's underground quarters. He began to walk towards it, his steps shaky yet resolute. I followed, pulled in by a sense of familial duty and morbid curiosity. As we descended into the darkness, my grandfather's unspoken past came alive around me, a terrifying specter of man's cruelty. The echoes of the unspeakable horror still lingered, painting the air with an indescribable dread. What awaited us down there? What horrors were my grandfather and his friends subjected to? With each step, my heart pounded louder, the drumbeats of fear drowning out reason. I could taste the fear, metallic and bitter, at the back of my throat. The friendly afternoon of Harper's Glen had spiraled into a terrifying dusk, full of unspoken horrors and gruesome revelations. In the gloomy depths of the hatch, the air was stale, heavy with decades of unvoiced stories of terror. As my eyes adjusted to the faint light, I saw the remains of what once were living quarters, now nothing more than a sinister monument of torment. The walls were lined with disturbing scratches, chilling reminders of the pain endured here. A rusty metal bed stood in one corner, its twisted frame a silent witness to the unspeakable horrors it had hosted. Frank's steps faltered as we stepped into the heart of the room. He was no longer the mysterious stranger I had picked up. His tough exterior had melted away, leaving behind an old man haunted by the cruelty he had survived. A shudder ran through me as I realized that my grandfather had been a part of this terrifying history. In the dim light, Frank moved towards a grimy wall, his fingers tracing over 3 carved names: Peter, William, my grandfather, and Frank. A lump formed in my throat as I looked at their names etched onto the cold, unfeeling stone, a poignant epitaph of their struggle. The room pulsed with an energy that was palpable, a lingering malevolence that seemed almost sentient. The fearsome overseer may have been long gone, but his reign of terror had etched itself so deeply into the very fabric of this place that it felt alive, waiting, as if the past could replay itself any moment. As Frank and I stood there, bound by a shared history I had just discovered, something shifted. A bone-chilling breeze swept through the room, whipping up dust and making the old chains attached to the wall clink, a sinister symphony that resonated in the dreadful silence. It felt as if the overseer himself was there, his evil laughter echoing around us. Suddenly, the horror stories weren't just stories anymore. They were a terrifying reality my grandfather lived through, a reality that I was now a part of. The dread of the past clung to me, the darkness of the room seeping into my soul, casting long, menacing shadows on my sanity. The sawmill was no longer an abandoned building, it was a beast, feeding off the dread of the past, the fear it instilled in the present. And I was caught in its monstrous jaws, my screams swallowed by the silent walls. As we stood in the room, Time seemed to stretch into an eternity, each second pulsating with the echoes of the past. It was as if we had stepped into a chilling time capsule, an archive of human cruelty and resilience. A part of me wanted to bolt, escape this nightmare, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, trapped by the chilling reality of my grandfather's horrifying past. Then, Frank broke the silence. "We need to do it, Jack. We need to set them free." "Set who free?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The victims, the lost souls of this place," he said, looking at me with teary eyes. "We need to tell their story, make the world know what happened here." The idea was terrifying yet compelling. I was scared, there was no denying that. But I also felt an obligation, a duty to honor my grandfather's courage, his resilience, and the promise he had made with his friends. Together, we decided to expose the history of the sawmill. To unearth the buried secrets of the past and to break the silence that had shrouded Harper's Glen for decades. We emerged from the hatch, leaving behind the chilling aura of the underground room. As we stepped back into the decaying sawmill, I could feel the heaviness lifting, replaced by a newfound resolve. We went back to the town, gathering the townsfolk to share the horrifying history of the mill. The revelation was met with shock and disbelief, a ripple of fear spreading through the crowd as the truth sunk in. It was an upheaval, a painful reckoning for all. But it was necessary. The ghost of the overseer was finally being exorcised. His reign of terror ended not with a scream, but with the power of truth. That day, Harper's Glen changed. We changed. The town's worst horror had been brought to light, its chilling grasp on us finally loosening. But the fear, the raw, primal terror I felt that day, it stayed with me. Every 3 p.m., when the world goes eerily quiet, I remember the old man on the road, the abandoned sawmill, and the horrors etched into its walls. The horror wasn't lurking in the shadows or hiding under our beds, it was buried deep within our past, silently echoing through the years. My story doesn't have ghouls or ghosts, but it does have fear. A fear so real and deep, it's scarier than any monster under the bed. Because the true monsters, as I discovered, often walk among us, wrapped in the guise of normalcy, leaving behind scars that span generations.